Mr. Mohanty, General Manager, Southeastern Railway, Mr. Sharma, General Manager, Eastern Railway, Mr. Vipin Kumar, SDGM, Eastern Railway, Mr. Nayak, SDGM, Southeastern Railway, officers and friends of the Southeastern Railway, Eastern Railway and Metro Railway present here today, ladies and gentlemen, I have to start with a thanks and with a confession. The thanks, of course, is due to all of you for inviting a person who is not a doctor with a deep sense of religion and philosophy like my predecessor from this podium, but a simple doctor who works as a neurosurgeon, as a speaker to your very special meeting today. The confession I have to start with is I'm not sure why I have been invited to this meeting, because I neither have the credentials of Swamiji, nor is the medical profession considered to be the symbolism of integrity in the world today. I have not used the Indian Railways for the last 4 years, although I am due to travel next weekend by Southeastern Railway after a long gap. And I have to confess that although I have been a professor of neurosurgery at the Ramakrishna Mission's Vivekananda Institute of Medical Science, and I've been an academic director of neurosurgery in the Park Clinic, which is a non-profit making hospital in this city, and the first private hospital established in the city of Calcutta in 1938. Yet neither the Eastern Railway nor the Southeastern Railway nor the Metro Railway send any of their neurosurgery patients either to the Vivekananda Institute of Medical Sciences or to Park Clinic, but send them all to hospitals in the south. Luckily for me, from some of my friends in the south of India, some of these railway patients are then redirected to me back to Calcutta. So I really don't know what my credentials are of being a speaker in this meeting. But I thought I will choose as the theme of my talk, paradox of ethics and the need for vigilance. And may I borrow that matchbox that respected Maharaj had in his hand, because I have a little take on that matchbox as well. I'm going to start with a disclosure. You know, in medical talks, we have to start with disclosures today. We have to say, you know, I've come here and I've not been sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. So what I'm saying is not because of them. So my disclosure is, what I'm going to tell you is my view of the world. I'm a simple human being. I spend my time doing brain surgery. Brain surgeons are not the most brainy people in this universe. My wife always told me brain surgeons are different from other doctors because brain surgeons require one brain, and that is the brain of their patient. So you don't expect me to say anything terribly brainy to you today. But when I start with this little figure, and I show this worldwide and say, can you tell me how many lines are not parallel? Then I've had different people stand up and say 2 lines are not parallel, some say 4 lines are not parallel, some say 6 lines are not parallel. But if you look very carefully, every single line in that picture is parallel. But our eyes deceive us into thinking that some of them are crooked and not straight. And which brings me to the very fundamental concept of integrity as I have understood it, for which I will, with permission, borrow the matchbox example from Swamiji. You know, we always talk about people in our organizations, in our hospitals, in your railways, as being good and bad. People who have integrity as a way of life, people who do not. In my world, every human being is like a matchstick in this matchbox of Swamiji. Some matchsticks have to be struck twice, thrice, 4 times before they light up. Some you strike once and they light up. But every matchstick is capable of giving the same amount of light to this world and extinguishing the same amount of darkness. So I thank Swamiji for giving me this example, but this is the way I look upon the world. Everybody is good and everybody has the integrity of a way of life. You just have to strike some people many times and rub that matchstick against the matchbox many times before they shine. Let's start with some basic concept. What is ethics? Ethics, if you look at the origin or the word, comes from a Greek word ethos, which means moralizing what is right and what is wrong. To my mind, this is the most fundamental concept of integrity and ethics. It is the most important reason why we need to have God and religion in this world. It is the most important reason why I say as a neuroscientist that we are taught, we perceive the world through 5 senses. You know the 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. But there are senses beyond this. Men of religion have called it, as you've just heard, an unknown energy that you may regard as God. You may regard as some form of spiritual energy that we cannot perceive with our 5 senses, because there are other senses that we as simple human beings lack. Today, the world has advanced. We have a telescope out in outer space looking at the systems beyond the solar system, and physicists have been able to identify things called dark particles. A dark particle is a particle in outer space that cannot be qualified by any known physical dimension. But physicists know it exists. A child who is born colorblind sees the whole world as black and white, never appreciates there is red and green. To him, the world remains black and white. To us, that possess only 5 senses, we can appreciate only the world through these 5 senses. But there are more senses which we do not have, which people who strive to reach greatness, like Swamiji, for example, are in possession of somewhat, and a lot of us do not have at all. Therefore, we perceive the world in black and white like the child with color blindness, and do not see a lot of things that happen in this world. Value is another word which is of very great importance to us. What is a value? A value is a preference about a course of action. That means a value is something that tells me, what do I need to be right? Do I need a conscience? Do I need honesty? Do I need justice? Do I need discipline? Do I need principles? So that's what a value is. You know, everything about ethics and values stems from our own religion's concept of swa. Swa, which means one's own, a feeling of identity, a feeling of, for lack of anything else, I call mineness. So Swa Dharma is the real religion. It is the religion of one's being. It is the religion which is determined by one's inner tendencies, inclinations, and mental impressions. This is why Swami Vivekananda said, we should live according to our psychological makeup, our bent of mind, our aptitudes. In short, he said, be yourself, don't imitate others. Stand on your own feet. And ethics is that which is born because of a person's autonomy of thought, will, and action. And it is ethics which teaches us to stand up. What is vigilance? Vigilance is to be aware of one's thought and actions and to ensure that one remains within one's own ethics. So you set your standards of ethics, and vigilance is what you do to monitor those standards of ethics. In fact, to a neurosurgeon, vigilance has a lot of meanings. This is a current publication on vigilance. Vigilance is a brain function, and this is an article using brain-computer interface saying that vigilance is a method of communication that the brain uses. A neurology clinic has a chapter dedicated to vigilance and its disorders, because vigilance is something that only our brain is capable of. And therefore, this is perhaps the only link I can see from a professor of neurosurgery to be invited to a vigilance week. Because vigilance is a function of the human brain. And in fact, we now know that neuroanatomical, neurophysiological, and neurochemical data suggest that vigilance is a specialized function of the right cerebral hemisphere. This is quotation from this article. And if you want it enlarged, you can read it as well. And therefore, vigilance, we know, is something that is controlled by our right brain. If you read this fabulous book called The Ethical Brain, you realize that the first thing the author says is the believing brain. It's a brain that believes in self, in the human being. And it again says that the brain function which controls ethics is placed in the right hemisphere. Amazingly, both ethics and vigilance, neuroscientifically speaking, are located in the same part of the human brain. So ethics, in short, is the code of right living, and vigilance, in short, is thinking about the good and bad, and finally choosing to adhere to the good. Swamiji told you a lot about inner satisfaction and inner peace. I always tell my students, and I have just finished 20 years as being a professor. In fact, the Ramakrishna Mission's Vivekananda Institute of Medical Science denied me being professor when I first applied 21 years ago, saying that I was underage because I hadn't reached 40 yet. I'm happy to tell you I've finished 20 years now. And I, for 20 years, tell my students only one thing. To me, ethics is, as a doctor, I'm a neurosurgeon, so I can't talk about the rest of the planet. I'm sure general managers of Eastern and Southeastern Railway have a far more difficult job in their hands than I have. But as a doctor, my only concept of ethics is, and I tell my students this all the time, when I go to bed at night, I tell myself I have no regrets for anything I have done all day. And I teach my students, if there is one teaching that I can teach you as a professor, it is to learn to go to sleep without having any regrets that you've done anything wrong that whole day. And tell yourself, I've done what is right. So I always tell my students, and you know today in the world of corporate medicine, a lot of my students are working in big corporate hospitals where they earn about 10 times what I do. And they are pressurized to operate on more and more patients. Regret to say, sometimes without adequate indication. And I always tell them one thing. When you're operating on this gentleman who is 76 years old with a brain condition, and you're telling the relatives, your father needs surgery, before you announce this, pause for 30 seconds and ask yourself, if this was my father, would I have liked him to have surgery? Only if the answer is yes, tell your patient's relatives that their father needs surgery. That to my mind is ethics, and that to my mind is vigilance in my small sphere of life in neurosurgery. In fact, you heard a lot about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. You perhaps won't believe it if I tell you that the first ever dying declaration, you know, the dying declaration is considered the most honest statement any human being ever gives. Courts of law, police, the judiciary, without question accept the dying declaration. And the first ever dying declaration recorded comes from the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata. And it is the old sage lying on a bed of thorns because he can choose the time he will die. And this is what he has to say. He says, the code of right living in which I have instructed you is not derived from the Vedas. It has been arrived at by personal experience through awareness of the world. One cannot fulfill the trajectory of one's life by merely acting according to prescriptions in books. the way of integrity dawns in the reason. One has to think deeply about good and bad and finally choose to adhere to the good. This is from the Mahabharata. But I'm not going to talk about religion because you have heard a much more experienced speaker and a much more learned man talk about it. I will tell you a little bit about ethics that governs doctors today and talk a little bit in the next few minutes that I have. And feel free to stop me if it's too boring, to talk to you about ethics of relationship which doctors have with their patients. And of course the biggest question that we have is this, and I excuse myself and come a little out of this podium. I'm not very important and I'm not used to speaking from behind big podiums. So the real problem we have is, I'm actually used to speaking to a class of 500 without a microphone, so I don't need a microphone. But the real problem we have is this in the medical profession today. The conflict between integrity and economy, as well illustrated in this little cartoon that you see. And of course, the fundamental of medical ethics is on these four things. Autonomy, which is the right a patient has. Justice, which means that we have to distribute our ability to help human beings across society. Beneficence, which means that we have to do good for the patient. And non-malfeasance, which means that whatever we do, we must not harm the patient who is another human being. You know, my greatest achievement as a neurosurgeon is this, that I get a patient, and I say this to all my students, that when you become neurosurgeons, remember you have a human being who is your equal, who is surrendering himself completely to you, lying naked in front of you inside an operation theater, and allowing you to touch his most religious, holiest organ, his brain, which is that bit of the human being that brings us closest to our Creator, which tells us that we are different from other living creatures that inhabit this planet of ours. And we are getting the honor of actually touching that organ to try and help another human being. As Swamiji said, it is an honor to be able to get the chance to do that service. And I think that's the first realization I teach my students as neurosurgical trainees to learn. So non-malfeasance means we must not do harm to our patient. But the biggest problem that we face as doctors on this planet, and particularly in this country, is whom should we treat? Should we treat those who demand our treatment? So those who can pay for it or have insurance? Or those that need our treatment, but neither have the resources to pay for it, nor have the insurance, nor can go to railway hospitals where they can be admitted and treated? Who should we treat? And of course, the philosophy of modern medicine is based on this book, First, Do No Harm. So do what you like to help your patient, but make sure you do no harm. Interestingly enough, if we go back to our own history and look at the relationship that doctors had with patients in this very sacred country of ours, here in the Charak Samhita is written, he who treats his patients only on humanitarian grounds, without desire or money or personal benefits, supersedes all other physicians. In fact, in the Charak Samhita, this is written, the patient may doubt his relatives, his son, his parents, but he must have full faith in his physician. So it not only lays down what is necessary for a doctor to do, it also lays down how a physician must surrender himself to the doctor. And this is the verse from the Mahan Upanishad, Ayam nija paravedi jnanam lahu chetasam udara charitanam tu vasuidara kutumbakam, which means that the physician has to regard all his patients as being members of his own family. Remember what I said to my students? If this was your father, your son, would you have operated? Would you have given this medicine? Would you have sent him for an MRI? If the answer is yes, do it for your patient. Don't do it otherwise. It's words that our Upanishads have written thousands of years ago. In fact, you'll be interested to know that it's only in New England, as late as in the 17th century, that doctors were first allowed to charge any money for treatment they gave to their patients. It was assumed that doctors were supposed to offer medical services free. Half of the world think that's true today also. But the problem is that things have changed in doctor-patient relationship. And today, we have transparency. We've been very serious this morning. So I will look upon the world of doctor-patient relationship from my somewhat non-serious point of view. I already told you we see things differently when we look at lines. And we have a lot of difficult problems as far as ethics is concerned as doctors. What about euthanasia? Euthanasia is one major issue where there are a lot of ethical issues. The right to refuse treatment. A patient can say, I know I've got a brain tumor, I'm not going to live, I do not want any treatment. What about the do not resuscitate orders that we sometimes in writing and sometimes verbally say, when we say don't treat this patient anymore? Are we justified in playing God? I always feel, and I always tell the relatives of my patient, if this was my father in this state, I would not treat him any further. Because what modern treatment can do is not prolong his life, but prolong his act of dying. And as doctors, if we cannot prolong life, we do not have the right to prolong anybody's act of dying. And therefore, we have to withhold treatment sometimes. Before, we had a paternalistic model. We heard that Dr. Bidhan Chandra Rai used to stand at the door of the house and say, I know that this is malaria. But that doesn't work today. Today we have to rely on informative models. The patient comes to us already having read everything on Google. You know, I had a patient in Ramakrishna Mission last Monday in my outdoor who's a taxi driver. And he told me, I've got this disc. He said, ये microsurgery नहीं होगा? I said, नहीं, ये microsurgery नहीं होता. He said, मैं goggle में देखा है, होता है. So you see, even taxi drivers goggle and find out whether you can have microsurgery. Of course, he may have goggled the wrong site. But the problem is that today, and this is really the saddest reason for being a doctor. I'm a third generation doctor. And I hate to say it, that my son is going to be a doctor in 1 month's time from now. And I almost prayed reverently that he didn't take up this profession when he had a chance to choose. Because I think no sensible person should go into medicine today. And why do I say that? I say that because we cannot have a doctor-patient relationship anymore. We have lost a relationship which was so precious to all of us. And we have lost it because of two reasons. We have lost it because in the public sector there is a shortage of funds, shortage of resources. So doctors cannot do what they should do scientifically, morally, and ethically. And in the private sector, the destiny of doctors are controlled by businessmen who do not think morality, ethics, and science are the three important priorities of running a corporate hospital. And the worst thing that has happened in my mind, and something in 30 years of neurosurgical practice I have completely been dissociated with, I can proudly say, is medical advertising. I put this up because this is a truth of where we are and why we have destroyed doctor-patient relationship. This is a Bombay newspaper I picked up in a Jet Airways flight some years ago. In fact, I think 2 years ago. There are 3 hospitals in Mumbai, 1, 2, and 3. This hospital says we were the first to perform this surgery with this stent in the heart, and says we performed it on that day, I think at 7:37 a.m. This hospital says, no, we were the first, we did it at 6:45 a.m. And this hospital says, no, we were the first, we did it at 7:10 a.m. 3 hospitals on the front page of a newspaper in this country, each one advertising they were the first to do a procedure. How ridiculous are we going to get with advertising our profession? And how can we have any ethical standards in a doctor-patient relationship after that? Here's some statistics that may shock you. If you drive today from Calcutta Airport to Goria, there are 22 advertisements for hospitals and clinics. There are 7 where doctors and their teams actually feature on those advertisements. So they're there with cardiac surgical team from XYZ hospital labeled. And then if you add to the advertisements of doctors and hospitals on the lampposts, they cross 100. To gain these statistics, I've actually been driven from the airport to Goria and counted it for a talk previously. So that's how sad the reason is. And this is why we will never have the principle of justice and liberty governing doctor-patient relationship as we should have and as was laid down almost 400 years ago. And the problem is that when I say this to medical audiences, they look at me and say, you live in the world of dinosaurs. We don't see the world the same way. I show this photograph to school children all over the world and ask them, what do you see? Do you know what middle school children see here? If I ask you, I know what you see. You see a man and woman in embrace. But when I show this to middle school children, do you know what they see? They see 6 dolphins. Now shut your adult eyes for a moment. Try to become a child and look at that picture again, and you will see 6 dolphins as well. That's the amazing thing about the human brain. We think what we want to think. So what is wrong becomes right because we want to think it is right, although in our hearts we know it is wrong. And that's why we need vigilance everywhere, in every day of every practice, because that vigilance will tell us that here we are fooling ourselves, thinking this is this when it isn't. Very difficult for adults to see dolphins, believe it or not, in this picture. But I'll lend it to you. Go and if you have children who are between the age of 10 and 12 and show it to them, they'll show you the 6 dolphins. In fact, we are now in a vicious circle as far as medicine and doctor-patient relationship is concerned. You know, some years ago, I told President Maharaj of Belur Math, he used to send me some very difficult patients. And amazingly, most of these patients, if not all of these patients, recovered after what I thought was very difficult, sometimes impossible brain surgery. And I met him once when he was admitted in Ramakrishna Mission Hospital, and I said to him, I don't know what it is, but the same patient, when they come to me directly and we did this operation, do not survive or survive with a major deficit or paralysis. But when you send a patient to me and say, go to him and get operated, they seem to all recover. I don't know the reason. I don't understand the reason. And he said to me this. He said, they recover because they believe you. And we have a lot of scientific studies in the world today which shows that if a patient trusts his doctor, his chances of getting better are much higher than if he is suspicious of his doctor. So the biggest problem we have today is the lack of confidence in doctors. People go and tell me, I tell them, where did you get operated? They say, oh, that huge hospital on the bypass. With difficulty, they remember the name of the hospital. They remember there were beautiful ladies greeting them with flowers when they came in. They remember there was a beautiful black marble staircase. They remember there was a 39-inch television in their room, and they had a lady coming every half an hour to change the water in the bottle. But they do not remember the name of the surgeon who did the operation, because it's irrelevant. Because they have been sent to a corporate hospital. That corporate hospital's name is the badge which has attracted them. So they have no relationship between their doctor and themselves. You know what is the most touching occasion in my life as a doctor? And I'm going to end by telling you this because I'm sure you're hungry and you're sick and tired of listening to all these words of wisdom. The most touching period of my life occurs And I'll give you two real-life examples. There was a young girl, 31 years old, with two children, aged 6 and 4. I can see her face every time I talk about her. She had a tumor in the brain in a place called the brain stem, which is the part of the brain that controls our heart and our breathing. She went to Vellore, she went to Newham, she went to a lot of major important hospitals in this country. She saw 7 neurosurgeons in this city. And everybody told her husband, and she had just returned from America and they'd settled in Durgapur, where he was setting up a computer engineering firm. And all the neurosurgeons said to him, your wife is 31, this is a tumor, if you touch it, she'll die. So better to let her live and die one day, she's not going to live more than a few more months. And with that he came to me. And he came to me referred by somebody who was very close to me. And this somebody who was very close to me was a patient of mine I'd operated on 4 times. You know, if you operate on another human being's brain 4 times, they are closer to you than your own family. And this gentleman sent him to me. And he said to me, I know my wife's going to die. I've gone all over the country. I've sent these to America. Please operate on my wife because I just want to try. She dies, it's fine. I'm not going to accuse you. And when I went through all the risks, she said, I know you doctors are very scared to operate. You think I'll take you to court, I'll take you to consumer court, this, that, and the other. I'll do nothing, I promise you. I'll give you in writing, but please try and operate on her. We spent 11 and a half hours operating on his wife. She spent 5 weeks in our intensive care, but was able to walk home and go to Durgapur. That's not the end of the story. In Durgapur, no, that's not, please don't applaud, there is no applause necessary for this story at all, it's a very sad story. In Durgapur, she was not adequately looked after when she had an infection of her chest 4 months later. She was admitted in a corporate hospital where a lot of money was spent, but her infection got so bad that she developed septicemia, which means infection affecting all your organs. And she was again transferred to our hospital in that condition on a ventilator. And in fact, she spent 5 weeks in our intensive care before she passed away. After she died, like I always do, I called her husband to my office, sat him down, talked to him, tried to offer him sympathy. No sympathy can get you back a wife who's 31 and a mother of 2 children who are 5 and 7. And he left. 5 days later, my secretary said, that man has come back with a big envelope. And of course, when anybody comes back with a big envelope and a patient has died, then you think this has to be a lawyer's letter. We would like to have the details of this patient because we would think there has been some negligence in treatment of this patient. He walked into my office. He gave me the letter. He said, Dr. Babu, apni kintu ei chichita khulben na. You will not open this envelope while I'm in your room. It made me convinced this was a very bad, rude letter from his lawyer. And then he left. I opened that envelope and there was a letter in it. It said, I have spent 8.5 lakhs of rupees trying to save my wife and failed. But I know you did your best. There are other people whose wives may have similar conditions, but who do not have 8.5 lakhs. I am therefore leaving a check of 9 lakhs for the next man whose wife may have this. And this was a true story, and this is the envelope. And as you can see, my voice changes even if I think about this today. There are still such human beings on this planet. And as I tell my students, the most touching moment for me comes not when relatives of patients who got cured, like you were applauding, and go back, come and say, Dr. Abu, you are God. Because you never believe. I always say believe patients' relatives when they say anything, never believe when they say you're God. But that's not the most touching moment. You know what is the most touching moment? The most touching moment is a moment that occurred in my life yesterday afternoon. My secretary is here, I'm not lying. A man came whose child had a brain tumor from birth. I've operated on that child 5 times and that child died at the age of 6 years. We operated first time when the child was 6 days old. Because the malignant tumor, we kept the child alive for 6 years. I told the parents, enjoy the child as long as we can keep the child alive, because he's a gift to you. But you will not have this child for long. Yesterday, the father came to see me, to tell me I've come to do Vijaya and Diwali. And said, you know why I have come? Because I've come to this hospital regularly for 6 years. And this is the first time for 6 months I've not seen your face or come to you. So I just came to say hello. And when a relative of a patient who has died comes back and wants to see the doctor, somewhere deep in your heart you think, you must have done something great. And these, to my mind, are the most touching examples. But you see, the problem we have today is our patients don't have confidence in doctors. The lower the confidence, the less the chance of getting better. We know this from science, from religion. And the less the chance of getting better, more the grievance on the part of the patient, and more the lack of confidence. So we are in a vicious circle. And that's the problem. And even worse is this. If you go to a government hospital, you're waiting and waiting. If you go to a private hospital, you're paying and paying. And now you don't trust your doctor, and you're not getting better, so you have less trust in the system and less trust in the doctor. And what does the administration do? The administration encourages you to believe that every death is due to medical negligence and every doctor is a criminal who's out to make money. So every way, practicing medicine today in this city and country is not the ideal with which we trained as medical students and what sort of doctors we wanted to become. Because patients are encouraged not to trust you. Unfortunately, those that encourage you are people that have administrative power to build hospitals, to improve hospitals, to ensure that people don't go to corporate hospitals after selling their land and cattle, but can go to a government hospital which can give them equivalent treatment. But since that is not possible, the best thing is to blame the doctors. I decry advertisements because the Medical Council of India's Code of Ethics clearly says no doctor or hospital should advertise. This is 6.1.1 paragraph. And therefore I end by telling you, and this is the anatomy department of the medical college that I entered. And I'll tell you the truth, I paid 75 rupees to get a challan to get into first year of the medical college. This is Medical College Calcutta, the first medical college established in Asia in 1835. When I got into this, I paid 75 rupees. I did not pay 1 rupee more to become a doctor, because every year I got some scholarship or the other. I took no money from my parents to become a doctor. I needed to take no money from my parents afterwards to go to England to pursue higher studies. And when I look back and say to myself, I remember what a very old teacher of mine said, and I went to a Jesuit school in Calcutta. And the principal of that school was a father from the Roman Catholic missionary. And he later became a cardinal called Cardinal Picacci at the Vatican. And he would always say, when you leave this school, remember one thing in life. All that we want to teach you is give back to society a little bit of what society has given back to you. And perhaps because I've spent all of 75 rupees to become a doctor, my take on morality or vigilance is completely different from what a lot of my colleagues' takes on this may be. But this is my take, this is my belief, and this is my belief in ethics and vigilance that lets me go to sleep at night and sleep, as my wife says, within 90 seconds of my head hitting the pillow, without taking any medicines and without needing any stress busters in my life. Thank you very much for your attention.